I think someday when we read the book of life, when we read the book of how a human body works, and let's say there'll be a chapter to the heart and a chapter to the skin and a chapter to your bones, I think the chapter about the brain will not only be the biggest chapter in that book, but it will have cross-references to every other chapter in that particular book. So I think another way to say it is the brain is as huge a mystery as humans are, in the sense that our brains are involved in so many different parts of our bodies, beyond just the idea of how we think and how we make memories and how we make decisions, but literally the kind of intimate relationship between the rest of our body, things from like our kidneys to our spleen to our intestines, are all fundamentally related to the nervous system. So to really understand the brain, you would have had to understand as much about the rest of the parts of the body as well, which is, I think, part of what makes the brain so mysterious. So I think what's remarkable about brains is, first, all of the things that they can do, but how similar some brains look to other brains that can't do the same things. So one of the things we work on is, what are the differences between a mouse brain and a human brain? Is there something obvious in the brain that could lead us to say, this brain obviously produces the Mona Lisa, and this brain just is interested in cheese all day. And when you look microscopically at at a human neuron or a mouse neuron, you can't tell the difference at all. And I think that's what's amazing about this idea that the brain is just hamburger. Not only is it hamburger, very similar hamburgers are found in animals that can't achieve the things that human brains can achieve. So something just not about the meat itself, but in the specific organization of the hamburger that I think gives human brains this remarkable capacities. So one of the ways I like to think about brains, and one of the ways I like to talk about brains, is that I think neurons, which are the cells that live in a brain, they're very similar to the single-celled organisms that live in a pond. So there are all these little single-cell paramecium, E. coli, and I don't think any particular neuron is any smarter than a paramecium or an E. coli or any of these other single-celled organisms. It's just that they live in the weirdest pond in the world, probably in the universe, for two reasons. One, they are so packed with other cells, other E. coli and other paramecium. That's the first. And then the second, all of those cells apparently are trying to achieve the same goal. Because if they all don't succeed, then the animal dies, and then evolution gets rid of it. So I think to actually live in a brain is not any more mysterious than it is to live as a single-celled organism inside a pond at the level of an individual neuron. But then something magical happens in the collective action of it. So imagine what it's like to be a single cell in a brain, a single neuron in a brain. You're completely in the dark. You don't sense touch. You don't sense sound. You live in a pool of liquid that's about 98, probably a little less than body temperature, so say 98 or 97 degrees. And the only thing you're aware of are the connections you have with other neurons and the connections you receive from other neurons. And when you receive this information from another neuron, you don't know whether it's visual information or auditory information. When you send out this information, you don't know whether you've made a decision or you've decided to wait, whether the human has decided to wait. So it's very much like each of these are sort of independent units, and they live in the dark without any knowledge of the world around them. But evolution and perhaps development have designed that network to give meaning to us. The basic principle that we think about neurons is that we want to excite them. And by that I mean a neuron is almost an electrical signaling unit. Most of the time it sits quietly, and then every now and then it fires a single electrical signal, which we call an action potential. And if we ask, what is it that can make one neuron fire an electrical spike and not another neuron fire an electrical spike? It's because it's receiving information via its connections from other neurons. And so when those other neurons decide to fire a spike or an action potential, they make our neuron fire a spike or an action potential, and that propagates the information. That starts with our eyes. So there are cells in our eyes that fire an action potential when they see a spot of light versus not a spot of light. You could collect many neurons that see different spots of lights in different parts of our visual world and wire them together so that we take those spots of lights and make a bar of light. Then you could take all the neurons that respond to bars of lights, wire them together, so now that we respond to a rectangle of light. And if you take enough neurons that respond to different shapes of lights, then you'll get neurons that respond to faces, which is just a collection of those shapes put together. And the idea about brains is that from the very external sensory systems all the way out to our prefrontal cortex that makes decisions, there are a series of abstractions where the neurons at some lower layer that are looking at spots of lights group together via their connections to make lines, and they group together to make shapes, which then group together to make faces. I think almost at the very first moment, we are transforming reality into something we can use. So if we think about how many sensors we have on our body. So as I was saying, in your retina, there are these neurons that respond to light. In each eye, there's probably millions of those neurons. And we have millions of neurons that respond to touch and temperature that across our skin. We have probably another million that listen to sound in each ear. If we paid attention to each little bit of information from each one of those sensors, we would become so overwhelmed that we wouldn't be able to make decisions or actions, which is what we need to survive. So at the very first layer, including deciding, am I going to listen to something versus look at something, are decisions that brains make that already start throwing away the vast amount of information that our sensors have collected about the world. If your eyes are open, you're receiving photons from throughout the visual field. Even if you're not trying to listen, you're receiving sounds, and even if you're not, actively touching things. My clothes are actively touching my body at any particular moment in time. And one of the very first things any brain has to do is to decide which of those millions of streams of information is the piece of information that the brain is going to use to make predictions and coding. So often, even though for example, often, even though as I move around, my clothes touch my body in 100 different ways, maybe 1,000 different ways. One of the first things that my brain has to do is not pay attention to the clothes on my body. And just like it does not pay attention to the clothes on my body to have that interfere with any decision that it's going to make, it also will not pay attention to 99% of the visual stimuli. Or if I'm paying attention to something with my eyes, I'm less likely to feel the taste in my mouth or to hear sounds from out in the street. And so I think the fundamental part of a brain is to actually decide about which of those millions of streams of information is the most relevant to that body at that particular moment in time.
And most relevant for our survival, right?
And I think the reason brains have to do that is that to survive, we have to make predictions and we have to make decisions fast. If we had to comb through, if the brain had to individually comb through those millions of pieces of information and decide which of them was important before it made a prediction or before it made a decision, we wouldn't have survived. And so even before predictions are made and decisions are made, the brain has to cull and immediately decide which of those pieces of information, which very small fraction of all of those pieces of information actually gets to be processed by the brain. I would say the reason we have brains, the reason brains have evolved, is to deal with the overwhelming information of reality and try to figure out a way to filter it as soon as possible to make a prediction, to make a decision. I think one way to think about why brains throw away so much information is that there are moments in our lives, perhaps there used to be more of these moments in earlier days, there are moments in our lives where making a decision is life or death. There's a tiger coming, there's a food source coming. And in those moments, you don't have time to analyze the billions of pieces of information that are coming in. You have to decide one way or the other. And I think those are the moments that have driven evolution to make us mostly sparse samplers of the world, or sparse samplers of all of the sensory information that we receive. And it's a fundamental part of our survival. It's not an artifact, perhaps, of humans, or it's cetera, it probably exists in the very earliest nervous systems, which is the very earliest nervous systems probably have to solve this problem of there's so much potential information to receive about the world, which is actionable and which is not. I think one way to think about a brain is what is a brain? Why could I not have all of the retinal photoreceptors that sense light in my eyes just directly connected to my muscles, so that every stimulus winds up in a motor action? And in fact, I think the definition of a brain is something that sits between our sensors and our motor actuators and actually decides which information to throw away. And in fact, that might be the purpose for why we've evolved brains in the first place. Yeah, so and one way to sort of think about how brains filter information is that at the very earliest stages in our eyes, for example, we have all of these particular sensors that detect light. But those sensors don't immediately send that particular information into our brains and into our cortexes. In the retina itself, they interact with each other and they compete with each other. So the sensor that sees light here and might compete with the sensor that sees light, at a different part of our visual field, and wind up competing with each other or voting for each other with which one piece of that information winds up being sent to our nervous system. In fact, another way to say it is that in our eyes itself, there's a part of our eye that has a very high density of these sensors called the fovea. And information that lands on those particular sensors has a higher competitive ability than information that votes on the periphery of our eyes. And so information from the inside of our fovea is much more likely to be sent into our cortex than the equivalent information that comes from the periphery. That's right. So in fact, in all of our sense organs, there is probably competition at the very earliest stages of detecting some sensory stimuli. That's fundamentally related to our ability to make decisions. So for example, in our auditory system, we probably want to pay attention more to loud sounds that are closer to us than sounds that sound distant. And so even at the level of our ears processing this auditory information, the sounds that come from closer to us or appear to come from closer to us have an increased competitive advantage to get that information into our brains versus sounds that come from far away. And one way to think about this is that we can try to imagine how much information is thrown away at any particular stage of the nervous system. So at our eyes, at our sensory systems, we're probably receiving millions of pieces of information per second, right? And in each stage, that information becomes abstracted and sampled out until you finally get to perhaps how many pieces of information a brain can keep at one moment in time. This is called short-term memory. And it turns out that after lots of psychological and cognitive studies in humans can keep track of something like 7 pieces of information, maybe 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at any one particular moment in time. And those 7 facts, for example, I think this is one of the reasons our telephone numbers are 7 to 9 digits, because we did a lot of work in how many numbers could you keep track of. And now actually psychologists think that the number might even be less. It might be 5. It might be 3 pieces of information. So we go from millions and millions of pieces of information at our eyes, and that information becomes so sparse and so abstracted that it's finally associated with 3 things to 5 things at any one particular moment at the highest levels of our processing. I think a great question, a great retort is that if I'm just keeping track of 1% of the information in the world, how can I drive a car? And it turns out that first, 1% of the information that comes in from the world is actually an enormous amount of information. In fact, it takes a brain probably of this size to deal with 1% of the information. And it's also because specifically when I'm driving, I'm not only using that 1% of that information, but I'm using the memory of where the cars were 5 seconds ago, the memory of where the pedestrians were 10 seconds ago. And I'm actually predicting at the same time I'm taking sensory information, where will those pedestrians pedestrians be 5 seconds from now? Where will the cars be 10 seconds from now? And in fact, to do both those predictions and those decisions, it would be impossible to collect the information. And in fact, driving a car, I think, is a remarkably good analogy for why we can only sparsely sample the world. Because if we had to actually pay attention to everything on the road at one particular time, and we know how long it takes approximately the brain to process information, it would take minutes, maybe even longer, before I decide to push the accelerator down or to push the brake or to turn the wheel right or to turn the wheel left. I think the idea that brains are storytelling machines, narrative machines, is something that's really just recently starting to emerge in neuroscience. But when you think about it, it's not surprising, because literally everything else brains do is about telling stories. Not just the people who write stories and make movies and make music and make art, but our legal systems are about telling stories. Our political systems are about telling stories. Our educational systems are about telling stories. So if we looked at all the ways that we've used brains, some vast majority of the applications of brains, philosophy, even our understandings of the universe, are really narratives where we often use analogies and story devices. So the fact that brains themselves use the narrative to guide the world becomes less surprising when we think about how many other ways we use our brains, which is almost always to tell stories. And you may say, well, what does fudging with reality have to do with making decisions? And I think it's because you have to make predictions fast. And actually, when you think about all the other ways where we make predictions, what a prediction is it's taking as much of the information in the world as possible, compressing it, excluding the things that are irrelevant to a prediction so that you can make a decision fast. A prediction is really a kind of a shortcut tool where you take a whole bunch of information, cut out the parts that are irrelevant, you hope, so that you can make a fast prediction, so you can make a fast decision. The vast majority of the brain's job is to say what is going to happen in the next few seconds. And in fact, in really species with larger brains that we associate with intelligence, all that happens is that ability to predict forward in time just extends and extends and extends. So maybe what a mouse does, what a mouse brain does, is actually predict what's going to happen in the next 5 seconds or the next 10 seconds. But maybe there's some animals that make tools, that like birds or primates, non-human primates, that can then make that prediction out to minutes or days or weeks. And what's amazing about human brains is that we try to make predictions out to years and decades. And it might be that our ability to make predictions over much longer timescales is fundamentally related to our ability to make narratives, which is fundamentally related to our ability to sort of parse out this huge information world. Well, sometimes when I think about brains, I get scared, and it's not. And I get scared for a bunch of reasons. I think two of them that I would list is that I'd like to believe that I am in charge of my life, that I am the agent of my life, that I actually can control my emotions, my abilities, my desires, etc. And the more I learn about brains, the more I realize that the idea of a Bobby Kasthuri inside my skull being in control of all of these things is probably not true. And I think it's that lack of control about my own abilities or my ability to control my body, I think is one of the scariest things. I think the second thing I think that sometimes scares me, is that what's left of me? Is there actually a concept of me left after I'm done learning everything inside, how every part of a brain works? And in fact, it's probably not. Perhaps it's probably true that if you could make neurons in a dish and connect them together in a way just based purely on physics and chemistry and et cetera, that dish Bobby Kasthuri would be me, my personality, et cetera. And the idea that I'm not unique and that I'm not in control are the two things that sometimes worries me when I learn too much about neuroscience. I'm not sure if we're close to solving the problem of consciousness. I think part of the issue is that we really need a much stricter definition of it. We need to know when we say consciousness, are we talking about being conscious of our internal states? Are we talking about being conscious of ourselves, introspection, versus being conscious of the world outside, being conscious of different people or different decisions versus internal consciousness? And it's might be possible that those are two different kinds of consciousness with mechanisms that are fundamentally different. Second, I think if you watch the world around us, there are algorithms now that are performing, that are able to do things that we thought algorithms wouldn't be able to do. Beat us in chess, beat us in poker, which always bothers me because that involves deception, beat us in Go. Are those algorithms feeling a sense of consciousness when they achieve those decisions? Is consciousness a thing that's actually made of biological matter? Or can consciousness be created in silico, if you will? And I think once we get to a better definition of what consciousness means, and a second thing is we probably, once we have that better definition, we need to know whether consciousness is something that's universal across all animals that have brains, or is it something that's only emerged in humans or non-human primates or et cetera. And I think once we get to better definitions and answers for that, then we'll be able to come up with experiments that actually tease out the actual mechanisms of consciousness.